Thanks, Orestes, and thanks for inviting me. It's really nice to be back in Scotland again. I've missed Scotland dearly, and this is my first time back here for 5 years, so shame it's going to be so brief, but excellent to be here. Very interesting morning. I'm going to continue on thinking about the relationship between personal level explanation, subpersonal explanation, but taking as my starting point the idea that the brain is a prediction machine. And so if we think that I should say that this is a collaborative work with Jelle Bruineberg, who's here, and Erik Rietveld. This is work that we're doing on a project called Skilled Intentionality for Higher Cognition. And one of the things that we're looking at in that project is understanding predictive processing in the context of embodied cognition, enactive cognition, things that Andy's written about at length in his new book. Okay, so let's suppose that predictive processing is our best current theory of the Undermind, our best subpersonal, our best explanatory theory of what's happening at the subpersonal level. So we think that the brain causally constitutes cognitive processes by doing something that approximates Bayesian reasoning. What kind of implications would that view of the subpersonal mechanisms have for this ongoing debate about the boundaries of the mind? So that debate about the boundaries of the mind that plays out within extended mind theory is a debate about the undermind. It's a debate about the subpersonal mechanisms that causally constitute cognitive processes, and whether those mechanisms line up with the boundaries of the biological agent, or whether they can extend out into the world. So the question is whether cognition is always instantiated in the head. And if we think cognition is realized in the brain in the form of predictive processing, then should we think that that predictive processing only happens in the brain, or should we think that sometimes predictive processing can be instantiated in what Sean Gallagher's recently called a mix of brainy, bodily, and worldly processes? And so this is a debate where we're concerned with the subpersonal mechanisms, we're concerned with how to understand neural processes, and we're not yet making any claims about things going on at the personal level, so perceptual experience, for instance. But I've put up here conservative and radical predictive processing, and these are takes on predictive processing that also make some claims about the personal level perceptual experiences, the nature of perceptual experience. So there's an inference that's being made then from what the brain is doing to something at the personal level to do with perceptual experience. And it's really that inference that I'm going to be interested in today. So this is just on the boundaries of the mind issue, but we'll see that actually what Jakob Hoey is saying here has implications for how we think about personal level explanation, how we think about perceptual experience. So this is conservative predictive processing. Hoey says mind begins where sensory input is delivered through extraceptive, proprioceptive, interoceptive receptors, and ends where proprioceptive predictions are delivered mainly in the spinal cord. So the idea here is that predictive processing is just something that happens inside of the head. And so there's some kind of boundary that's separating the brain from the rest of the body and the world. And so you can see clearly that this has bearing on the boundaries of the mind question, but it also, we'll see, has bearings on how we think about perceptual experience. So there's an inference that Hoey wants to make from this kind of view of what the brain is doing to indirect realist theory of perception, where perception doesn't put us directly into contact with the world, but instead we only have access, perceptual access to the world through some kind of inferential processes happening in the brain. Whereas radical predictive processing offers a different way of thinking about prediction, where prediction is part of an embodied active system self-organizing around this quantity of prediction error. And the result of this self-organizing process, which is embodied and which can also be scaffolded by the world, is that we get some kind of grip on structured, meaningful world. And it's that notion of grip that I'm going to be interested in. So there are many things going on in this quote. So we get claims being made which have implications for the boundaries of the mind issue, the extended mind debate. We get the argument that dynamically what's happening is a self-organizing process that involves the whole embodied active system in its interactions with the world. But we also get some personal level implications being drawn from that about what it is to perceive. What it is to perceive is to have grip on a structured and meaningful world, a world that we encounter in experience and action. So there's exactly that inference that's being made from what is our best theory, I think, of what the brain is doing, to a claim about personal level experience, a realist claim, a claim that we are able to directly experience and engage with a structured, meaningful world based on these processes that are happening in the brain. So there's a debate about the undermind, about the subpersonal mechanisms, about what the brain is doing, where on the one side we have conservative predictive processing saying that there is some kind of boundary between the brain, the body, and the rest of the world, and the brain has to somehow get access to the hidden causes that are producing inputs across that boundary. That's the conservative predictive processing view. Then we have radical predictive processing that disagrees about where to draw the boundaries of the mind, says that the mind is a self-organizing, embodied system that we can understand at the level of the whole agent interacting with the environment. So there's an inference that's being made here from subpersonal explanations about what the brain is doing, to making personal level claims about perceptual experience. And it's that inference that I'm interested in. So on the one hand, we have these ideas about what the brain is doing being used to defend an indirect realist theory, and on the other side, we have the same ideas, seemingly, about what the brain is doing, being used to argue for what Andy calls at least a not indirect realism. And I'm going to try and push Andy towards a stronger direct realism. Now, that's a way of arguing from what the brain is doing to make some personal level claims. And I want to try and mediate this debate by going from the other direction as well, by starting from what I'm going to call animal level explanation, so not personal level explanation, because this kind of explanation applies to the simplest living things, single cell bacteria, can be described in the terms that I'm about to lay out. So the kind of explanation is explanations that go down to the most basic living forms. But what's distinctive about them is that they're explanations at the level of the whole living system in relation to the world or to an environment that is meaningful. And what I want to try to argue is that explanations that start out at this animal level can also constrain how we understand the subpersonal explanations, and in particular can mediate between a view of what the brain is doing, where there's this strong boundary separating the brain from the body and the world, versus the more dynamical self-organizing theory that Andy argues for. So the aim of my talk is to defend the validity of this kind of whole animal level of explanation, and then bring that to bear on this debate between conservative and radical PP. And I'm going to draw my animal level explanations from what's called the enactive theory of cognition. And as I just said, I'm going to try to use that enactive theory to decide between these two interpretations of what's happening at the subpersonal level. So, what is the enactive theory exactly? Well, there are two core claims that I want to attach to the enactive theory. It has lots of different forms in the literature. You've got sensory motor enactivism as defended by Alva Noe. You've got autopoietic enactivism as defended by Evan Thompson, Ezekiel de Paulo, and others. And in Amsterdam, we're kind of, Dave's also got a kind of enactivism that he defends, which he traces back to Susan Hurley. So there's lots of different kinds of enactivism, but the enactive theory that I'm going to be interested in today is made up of these two claims. Mind-life continuity on the one hand. So this says that principles or concepts that explain life will also explain cognition. So the idea here is that you couldn't have a cognizer without there being a cognitive perspective on a world that is meaningful. And so to explain how there comes to be such a thing as a cognitive perspective on a meaningful world, we have to appeal to the same principles that explain life. So that's a defining feature of cognition, that there is such a perspective, and the explanation we give of that will be explanations that also apply at the level of living systems that can maintain their organization in their interactions with the environment. The second key claim, which I take from Gibson, and Gibson takes it from an older tradition in philosophy that was drawing on evolutionary biology and ideas from Darwin, is the complementarity between the animal and the environment, or what's called an animal-environment mutualism. So this is captured well by Gibson, writing about, in his ecological approach to visual perception, writing about affordances. He says that values and meanings of things are in the environment and can be directly perceived. So what did he have in mind by that? Well, first of all, that what we encounter in perception is not a world of physical objects and properties and events that are neutral in their value. Rather, what we encounter are objects that can be used in a particular way, that have a value for us because of how they can be used. So we encounter food that is eatable, for instance, fire that's dangerous, materials that can be made into clothes that can be worn. That's the kind of environment that animals relate to, first of all. They relate to an environment that is made up of things that can be used, or what Gibson called affordances. And Richard Lewontin's explaining the same idea of this animal-environment mutualism in his book, The Triple Helix here. He's writing about birds in particular in this passage, but making a more general claim that what the animal's sense organs, nervous system, metabolism is keyed into are bits and pieces, he says, of the surroundings that are relevant to the animal. So the environment that the animal inhabits is an environment that is meaningful and valuable in the sense that it is relevant in some way for the animal's way of life. So the bird will encounter sticks that it can make into a nest, the aspects of the environment that it's selectively sensitive to are aspects that are relevant in some way. Okay, so we have life-mind continuity and animal-environment mutualism. These are the two key claims of enactivism. And they're related claims in that one is on the side of the organism and is about the principles that explain life also explain what it is to have a cognitive perspective on the world. And animal environment mutualism is about the worlds that the animal is related to. So it's not a pre-given world, as the enactivists say, into which the animal is parachuted. It's a world that is made up of things that complement the animal's morphology. That's what Lewontin is talking about here. But not just the animal's morphology, but also the abilities of the animal, what the animal can do in that environment. The environment is made up of possibilities for action that complement the abilities of the animal. So that's what I'm calling animal environment mutualism. Okay, so these two claims define what I'm taking to be the core of the enactive theory. Now, how could that be of relevance to this debate about what the brain is doing, this debate about predictive processing? Well, the link here is what Friston has called the free energy principle. And this is a principle that Friston describes in order to explain what's distinctive about living systems. And it doesn't just explain that, according to Friston, it also explains cognition. So we have exactly that mind-life continuity that I described in enactivism, that the principles, the concepts that we use to explain life will also explain mind. So here's a little thought experiment from this paper by Friston and Stefan, where they ask us to think about the difference between an ordinary snowflake that as it falls to the ground crosses a phase boundary where there's a change in temperature so that the snowflake can no longer hold itself together. It disintegrates into water drops. So contrast that snowflake with an imaginary snowflake that now has wings and can keep itself in the air so that it is in the right temperature for maintaining its form. Now, what's crucial here is that you have a system that can maintain its organization through its interactions with the environment, through its actions. It can fly up to the right height in the atmosphere so that the temperature is at the right level for it to maintain its form. And the free energy principle is describing what it takes for, giving a mathematical description of what it takes for a system to keep itself within the right range of states that are essential for its viability in its relation to the environment. So this is where things get technical, and I'm not going to go into all of the technicalities, but I will give you the rough idea of how it's supposed to work so that we can see how a principle that explains life, that explains how living systems can resist this tendency to disorder, could also help us to understand cognition. And so the core idea behind the free energy principle is that this is a defining feature of the kind of self-organizing system that living systems are, that they can, in their interactions with the environment, resist this tendency to disorder. And it tells us how systems do that. They do it by minimizing what Friston calls the free energy bound on disorder. So we have to unpack now what is meant by this free energy bound. And the key concept we need here is that of surprisal. So there are certain states that the living system has to keep itself in order to maintain its organization, in order to survive, in order to persist. And so what exactly are these states? Well, we can think of them as the phenotypic states of the organism, the states that adapt the organism to its environment. So what's being called surprisal here is going to be unpacked in terms of mathematical quantities, in terms of probability theory, information theory. It's to do with the unexpectedness of the living system finding itself in certain states. So how are we to think about the expected states or the unexpected states? Well, I'm suggesting that we think of that in terms of states that adapt the organism to its environment, to the niche that it inhabits. So you should already be getting a sense of the two key theses that I've defined enactivism in terms of. Mind-life continuity, well, free energy principle explains both what it is to be a living system, a system that can resist this tendency to disorder, and it's also going to explain cognition, how it does that. We have to go into some more details about in a moment. And it also enfolds in this idea of surprisal an animal environment mutualism, because the states that are unexpected or expected, that the living system has to maintain itself in order to remain viable, are states that are to do with the animal being well adapted to its environment. So the expected states of the animal are going to be the states that are to do with its organization, that make it well adapted to the environment, or to do with the kind of niche that it inhabits. Let's have as an example of this initially. So body temperature, the human body keeps our temperature peaked around this particular value of 37 degrees. And when your body deviates from that temperature, then the body has to take action so as to restore us to that body temperature that is expected. That's what's called homeostasis, as you all know. But crucially, this is a body temperature that varies between species. So birds have a different body temperature that the probability distribution will peak around. So what counts as low surprisal for humans will be different for birds, for lizards. So you have temperature of the body, that the body regulates its activity in order to maintain, which is different in different species. So you have a kind of embodiment now which goes along with the way of life of that particular species. And the same thing can be said of the environment. I won't read this to you yet. So aquatic animals inhabit watery environments. So when it comes to maintaining themselves in expected states, minimizing surprisal, then what will be essential is that they find themselves in that familiar habitat. So what counts as surprisal will depend on the embodiment of the animal and also the niche that it inhabits. And that's exactly the kind of animal environment mutualism which we find in enactivism as well. So Friston, never easy to read, but he's capturing a central idea here that I want to build on. He says, I model myself as embodied in my environment and harvest sensory evidence for that model. And now we're getting into cognitive territory. So the free energy principle tells us what it is for a system to be a living system, but it also gives us some tools for explaining what the brain is doing. It gives us a mathematical schema for making sense of the structure and organization that we find in the brain. So I'm going to now unpack that a little bit more. You won't get it from this quote. We'll have to do a little bit more work. That's just illustrating that surprisal is not only to do with the animal's embodiment, the organization of the body, but also to do with the habitat that that animal inhabits. Okay, how am I doing for time? How much time do I have?
You have 3:30, you want half an hour of Q&A. A little bit more because we started late.
Yeah. So how much time do I still have? I need to know how much detail to go into. How much time do I still have?
Let's say another 35 minutes.
With enough time for questions as well? Yeah. Okay. So, what's the explanatory status of FEP? I've said that it's a mathematical schema. So the notion of surprisal gets unpacked in terms of information theory. It's an information theoretic notion. So probability theory is going to be used for explaining what it is for certain states of the animal to be unexpected. The animal itself doesn't know what it is, what states are expected, what states are unexpected. And so if it's to be organized in such a way as to minimize surprisal, it has to have something that stands in for that mathematical quantity, something that it can know about. So what is that thing that's going to stand in for this mathematical quantity, surprisal? And it's here that the free energy principle connects up with the Bayesian ideas about what the brain is doing and predictive processing as a way of implementing the free energy principle. I'll have more to say about that later on, but what I want to bring out for now is that we have a principle that applies at the level of the whole animal and its environment. That's what I've just been explaining. That then is supposed to tell us something about the structure and function of the brain. So going back to the Undermind theme, we have an explanation that's applying at the level of the whole animal and its environment. That's supposed to now constrain what we say about what the brain is doing, so what we say about the structure and organization of the brain. And so we're going from a whole animal level of explanation, the free energy principle, to saying something at the subpersonal level. And my argument is that that's a legitimate way to reason. Part of my target here is Rob, who's been kind of arguing that there isn't a legitimate personal level of explanation. I want to say, no, there is. It's the level of the whole animal in its environment. And that can actually be constraining what we say about the brain. Okay, so that's just repeating what I already said. So here's a way of understanding how the free energy principle applies to at the level of the whole animal. Well, it applies at the level of the whole animal because of these two claims that I've said are distinctive of enactivism: life-mind continuity, animal-environment mutualism. Both of these can be read back into the free energy principle. So we get life-mind continuity because you have a principle that explains life, that living systems keep themselves in states that are expected because that's what it takes for them to be well adapted to their environment. And then we get animal-environment mutualism because the states that are expected are defined both relative to the embodiment of the animal and the environment that the animal inhabits. So free energy principle seems to satisfy the two defining features of enactivism as I've explained it. So how does the animal do this then? How does it minimize free energy? Well, because I'm understanding it at the level of the whole animal and its environment, I'm going to be looking for a way of explaining how this is done in terms of subpersonal mechanisms that relate to the dynamics of this whole animal environment system. And here I'm going to appeal to the idea that the animal is regulating its interactions with the environment based on things in the environment that are relevant or that are meaningful to the animal, namely the affordances that it has a grip on. And so the system that we need to look at here is an animal environment system where the animal is anticipating and regulating its interactions with affordances based on its anticipation of what will happen when it interacts with those affordances. So we can think of free energy as low when the animal anticipates its interactions correctly, and high when it fails to do so. So the animal can anticipate, the fish can anticipate being in an aquatic environment. When it's out of that aquatic environment, then it's having highly surprising interactions with the environment, and will have to attempt to regulate its interactions so that it gets back into its familiar surroundings again. So on the basis of this reading of what's happening, and obviously there's lots more to say about that, I'll say some more as I go on. On the basis of this inactive reading of the free energy principle, I then want to give an interpretation of the generative model. So what is the generative model? We've seen that surprisal is the long-term average states that the system expects to be in. And it doesn't have any way of knowing what those states are in advance. So it has to use some other quantities to ensure that it's in states that minimize surprisal. So what does it use? And so Bayesian predictive processing comes in here in that it's argued that the brain uses, on the one hand, its current state of activation, which is based on long-term regularities that it's learned. Some of them coming from its phenotype. Some of these long-term regularities come from the learning of the animal. But on the one hand, it has its overall current state of activation in the brain, which we're understanding in terms of prediction. That's why this is called predictive processing. And the predictions are coming from what's called a generative model, a model of these long-term regularities. So on the one hand, the brain has this current state of activation, its prediction, and on the other, it has its sensory inputs that can be compared with that prediction. So the extraceptive, proprioceptive, interoceptive inputs. On the basis of making those comparisons, then the brain can, by minimizing the discrepancy between the current state of activation, the predictions, and the inputs coming in, it can ensure that it stays in states that are expected. And it can ensure that because the quantity that it has access to, the discrepancy between its current state, its prediction, and what's happening in the world, that quantity is always, well, is in a mathematical relation to surprisal, such that if you keep that quantity within a certain bound, then you'll be minimizing surprisal. It's a complicated argument that I've just made there, but Friston has the mathematics to back it up. I'm not going to go into that more. What I want to do instead is focus on what it is to have a model of long-term regularities that can be used as the basis for making these predictions. And I want to look at something that Friston says in relation to this. He says the agent doesn't have a model, so there isn't a model in the brain which the agent has. Friston says instead that the agent is a model of its environment. And so there's this difference between having a model and being a model, which I want to now talk about a little bit more and understand that in terms of this inactive interpretation that I've given of FEP. So what is it to be a model of your environment? Well, I take it that's just to have an organization, a biological organization, so for the brain to be able to put itself into a certain state of activation based on its knowledge of long-term regularities that complements what's happening in the environment. So if we think of this in terms of the animal mutualism that I described to you earlier, then an agent is a model in the following sense. It's a model because it embodies in its structure and organization, not just the structure and organization of the brain, but the whole embodied animal. It embodies in its structure and organization abilities, skills, behavioral dispositions that complement its eco-niche. So Michael Turvey talks about affectivities in defining what affordances are. Those are behavioral dispositions of the animal that complement the affordances of the environment. So to be a model is to have behavioral dispositions that are instantiated in the structure and organization of the agent that complement the affordances that are available in the eco-niche. Then the second thing that we want to argue this means, so this is from the paper that I talked about at the beginning that I'm that we have a manuscript of, written with Jana Bruineberg and Erik Rietveld. So we say the second thing that being a model means is that there's some dynamics, coupled dynamics of the organism and the niche, which lead the organism towards having a good grip, an improved grip on its environment. So on the side of the environment are relevant affordances that the agent is drawn towards, and on the side of the agent are these dispositions, these abilities for responding in a way that takes you closer towards being in a relation of equilibrium with your environment. So it doesn't, you never want to be in a relation of equilibrium with your environment. That would be very bad. That would be amounting to not dealing effectively with the contingencies, the dynamics of the environment. So you want to be moving towards this equilibrium with the environment. And that's what we're talking about in terms of grip. So the organism as a whole is a model in the sense that in these two senses, it has an organization that complements the eco-niche, and that's an organization that's been built up through the history of interactions of the organism with its environment, and its behavioral dispositions are such that it tends towards having a good grip on the environment. Okay, we capture this in a figure here. So this is the agent environment system as a whole. And on the environment side, we have the what we call the landscape of affordances, which are relative to the form of life of the species, of the animal. And on the side of the animal, we have patterns of action readiness, which are anticipatory in that they anticipate what the animal would need to do to act adequately on the affordances that the environment offers. So the patterns of action readiness are responsive to the affordances in that based on the abilities that the animal has, based on its effectivities, the animal is then able to coordinate with the affordances of the environment, so is bodily responsive to those affordances. Okay, and the dynamical coupling is captured here in that there's this relation of mutual influence that the environment exerts on the animal and that the animal is exerting on the environment through its actions, through its selecting certain possibilities for acting on. Okay, so I've given you a description of an enactive reading of the free energy principle. Now what I want to do is consider what this whole animal level of explanation, what kind of implications does that have for what we say at the subpersonal level about what the brain is doing. So I've been arguing that at the subpersonal level, we ought to look at also at the level of the whole animal and its environment and the dynamics that unfold in that system as a whole. And that goes against what I call conservative PP at the beginning, which says that the brain is doing unconscious inference from its generative models, inferring what the hidden causes are in the world. It's arriving at hypotheses based on a process of unconscious inference, which then form the basis for your perceptual experience of the world. But your perceptual experience has doesn't put you into contact with those hidden causes. Those hidden causes remain hidden. So all your brain can do is issue its best guesses about what might be out there in the world. And I want to say that this way of understanding how FEP might be implemented is only one way of understanding, not the only way. So remember that FEP is supposed to be a mathematical schema that describes what living systems are doing so as to maintain their organization, that then constrains what we say about structure and function in the brain. And so we're going from a whole animal level of explanation to making some claims about what the brain is doing. The Helmholtzian theory of what the brain is doing, that it's doing unconscious inference, can be understood computationally along the lines that Rob was talking about this morning in response to Carrie. That view of what the brain is doing is a particular take on what it is to implement the free energy principle. And I want to suggest that there are also other interpretations we could give of how the free energy principle could be implemented that don't make appeal to unconscious inference. That's the argument I want to make in the last part of my paper. And I take it that Andy's doing something similar but not quite the same in his book. He's arguing in the book, and this is from the paper Radical Predictive Processing, that the brain is an organism for the environmentally situated control of action. And does it need to do that by means of unconscious inference? I'm not sure. Andy, I think, says yes, it does, but that's not inconsistent with saying that the brain is functioning, is an organ for environmentally situated control of action. I want to suggest that no, there's a different way of understanding radical PP where we don't have to think that the brain is doing unconscious inference at all. Instead, we can use ideas from ecological psychology, from dynamical systems theory to make sense of how the brain is doing this situated control of action. So here's what Hoey says in a manuscript to try to motivate the idea that FEP is implemented by Helmholtzian unconscious inference. And the motivation for this is what he calls the problem of perception. And the problem of perception is actually a problem at the personal level, as far as I can see. So what Hoey seems to be doing here is arguing from a claim about perceptual experience to what the brain must be doing. And I want to say, no, there's some premises here which we can challenge. I think Andy's also challenging this premise, but I think in a way that's going to push him towards having an even more ecological view than he does currently. So that's what I want to try to argue in the last part. Okay, so Hoey says here that the problem of perception is that there are these hidden causes out in the world. Helmholtz says this as well. And the brain only has imperfect access to those hidden causes via the senses. So all it has access to are these extraceptive, proprioceptive, interoceptive inputs, but those stand in a many-to-many relationship to the hidden causes in the world. So in order to infer what the most likely hidden cause is of the current input, the brain has to do some probabilistic reasoning and reason in a way that is an approximation of Bayes' principle. Now, what's the premise then that I want to reject? Well, I want to reject the premise here that the data delivered to the senses is what Hoey says imperfect data, because it stands in a many-to-many relation to the hidden causes in the world. And I want to say, well, no, once you have the right view of how sensing is controlled by action, then you won't think anymore that the data that the senses are delivering is impoverished in this way, is imperfect in this way. Rather, you'll think that either through the phenotype of the organism that fits with the environment that it inhabits, or through learning, you get a way of controlling the sensing that's being done, so that sensing is no longer imperfect in this way, no longer shielding you off from the hidden causes. So how should we think about active and perceptual inference? These are the notions that Friston introduces to explain how the brain implements the free energy principle. So remember, the free energy principle has to have access to these two quantities. What are they? The current inputs that are coming in, which then get compared with the current state of activation in the brain that is a prediction made on the basis of a generative model. So then there are two things that the brain can do with this prediction error signal that it gets, that it's processing. It can act so as to change its sensory input, thereby what Hoey would say explaining away, and Andy would say, and I think this is right, accommodating the sensory input. So the movements then are unfolding because there's some prediction error, which the brain is then controlling your movement so that that prediction error is no longer there because the sensory input that's coming in then matches what you're expecting, what the brain is predicting. So that's active inference. Perceptual inference is where instead of changing your predictions, so in active inference predictions are held constant, then the brain gets the sensory input it's expecting, predicting by moving. In perceptual inference, what the brain does is adjust or change its prediction. Going back to the inactive view of the free energy principle that I described, we understand these predictions in terms of action readiness. So there are different layers of action readiness, different layers that relate to what the animal is ready to do in relation to the relevant affordances in the environment. So the hierarchical organization in the brain relates to different spatial temporal regularities that are to do with being well prepared for acting on the affordances of the environment. So perceptual inference then means changing what you're ready to do, changing your action readiness. And changing your action readiness is a matter of changing the way in which you're doing your sensing, changing the way in which you're expecting, changing the expectations of sensory input that you have. So both perceptual inference and active inference, we are arguing, should be thought of as part of the process of regulating the interaction with the environment. That's why this should be understood at the level of the organism's grip on the relevant affordances of the environment. Perceptual inference is just about changing the way that you're controlling your sensing so that now the inputs that are coming in are the ones that give you a better grip on the relevant affordances. So perceptual inference is changing patterns of action readiness, and changing those patterns of action readiness is about changing how you're controlling your ongoing sensing so that your sensing now is giving you a better grip on the environment, a better grip on the affordances that are relevant to you. So how should we think about this relationship between the sensing that's being controlled through movement and the structure in the environment? Hoey says that structure's hidden. I'm saying no, it's not hidden, because the animal, either through its biological organization or through its learning, has ways of controlling its sensing so that it can be constantly getting a good grip on the relevant affordances in the environment. So how should we then think about the relationship between sensing and the structures in the environment? And here I want to draw on ideas from ecological psychology, modify them slightly, because they're in their standard form there's some problems. But the basic idea, I think, is right, that energetic stimulation, so this is not yet about the animal sensing, this is about light and the way it interacts with the surfaces in the environment, or other mechanical properties that might be sensed through the mechanical senses like touch. These kinds of patterns in energetic stimulation stand in a interesting, I'm going to say, reliable, co-varying relation to structure in the environment. Now, originally in ecological psychology, there was this very strong claim made that there's this relation of symmetry and specificity between the energetic stimulation, patterns in the energetic stimulation, in the optic array, for instance, and the environmental structure. So tau, for instance, that the gannets use, but also somersaulters and jugglers, apparently, is this variable that can be used that tell the gannets time to contact with the surface of the water, so that they can, by detecting that variable, fold back their wings just at the right moment so that when they land in the water, their wings are safe. So there's a variable here, time to contact, that is in the ambient optic array and the optic array and the energetic stimulation in the way that light is changing as the bird gets closer to the surface of the water, that's being exploited by the bird so as to control its action. But there's a very tight relationship between tau, for instance, and the environmental property, the environmental structure, such that there's a relation of specification. That's too strong. So we suggest weakening it so that there can be still patterns in the ambient array, in the energetic stimulation, so in the light that relate to the environmental structures, that are relations of reliable covariation. And these relations of reliable covariation mean that once the agent has the right ability, then it can use that structure, it can use that information to act on affordances. So there's a pattern in the energetic stimulation that bears some reliable, regular relation to structures in the environment. And the relation then between sensing and the structure in the environment is one that's mediated by this non-specifying information. So the brain of the animal, either through learning or through the phenotype of the animal, is going to be set up in such a way that it's now, well, they say, I'm going to say tracking, detecting that information relation between energetic stimulation that can be picked up by the senses and environmental structure. We can talk more about that in the questions, because I have to go quite quickly over it. But this idea of ecological information is going to be crucial, I think, for understanding what the relation is between the sensing that's being controlled by the animal and the environmental structure. And this is an important issue, because once we have that view of what the brain is doing, it's tracking these information relations, then that gives us a different way of thinking about what the generative model is. So the generative model is embodying sensitivity to these patterns in energetic stimulation that stand in this reliable co-varying relation to structures in the environment. What are those structures in the environment? They're affordances. And so by being able to pick up on this information relation between energetic stimulation and the landscape of affordances, the animal is able to maintain a good grip on the relevant action possibilities out there in the world. It's able to track those action possibilities. And this weaker notion of information, ecological information, means that we can also understand how the animal can be tracking absent possibilities, possibilities that aren't in its current environment. So this is part of what we want to argue in saying that these ecological ideas can also apply to higher cognition. So Andy has also this idea of grip, but he develops it in two ways, which I think is interesting. On the one hand, this is from the Southern Journal of Philosophy paper, we get the idea that what the animal has a grip on through the minimization of prediction error is its ongoing sensory barrage. So there's sensing that's controlled by the animal as it interacts with the environment, so that what gets delivered by the senses is just what's relevant, what matters to the animal, what's important to the tasks that the animal has to perform. So the example of the fielders that can get to the right place at the right time to catch the ball by tracking what's called optic acceleration of the ball through the optic array. This is one of the examples that Andy gives. So there's a controlling of the sensing that the outfielder is doing there. That means that the senses, that the sensory input that's coming in, the acceleration of the ball through the visual field, is just the right kind of inputs that the system needs to perform this task of getting to the right place at the right time to catch the ball. So sensing is being controlled by the agent in such a way that what it delivers up are just the inputs that are needed for the task that the agent is performing. And all of this is being done through the hierarchical predictions that are being made over multiple spatial and temporal scales. So when the good outfielder can minimize prediction error, then he's going to succeed in getting to the right place at the right time to catch the ball. So we get on the one hand the idea that minimization of prediction error gives you a good grip on the sensing that's going on the sensory inputs that are being delivered to the brain. So what the grip is on then is the sensing. But at the same time, Andy wants to say, no, what you have a grip on through being able to minimize prediction error is the distal environment, is what Hoey calls the hidden causes. So by minimizing prediction error, the brain gets access to those hidden causes in the environment. So we have two things here, that we have grip on the ongoing sensory barrage through minimization of prediction error. That might be thought of as what the brain has grip on. And then what do we have grip on? We have grip on the world. So what's the relation then between the ongoing sensory barrage and the world? I want to say, well, that relation there is mediated by ecological information. So it's because there's some relationship between the sensory barrage, the inputs that are coming into the brain, and the environmental structure, such that there's a reliable covariation relation between these two, that when the brain is minimizing prediction error, having a good grip on the sensory barrage, it also is giving the agent a good grip on the world. How is it doing that? By being attuned to, by tracking these information relations that hold between the sensory barrage and the environmental structure in the world. So is grip the new representation? I'm not so sure it is, actually. I think we could just as well say that grip, which minimization of prediction error is absolutely central to, no doubt about that, can be understood in terms of the dynamical coupling between the agent and the environment, where what the brain is doing is tracking these information relations between the energetic stimulation that's being picked up by the senses and the environmental structure, the affordances. So why does accommodating current sensory states give us a good grip on the world? Because the brain is tracking this reliable covariation relation between patterns in the energetic stimulation and the action possibilities out there in the world. So Andy says that the generative model, should I just hold on a second? Yeah. Have some water and pause. No worries, you got it? So Andy says that the generative model has to be a representation. There's lots more that could be said about this, because it encodes, I think Andy will happily talk in those terms, internal knowledge of these long-term regularities in the environment that allow the brain then to make good predictions that mean that it can indeed minimize prediction error and give the agent a good grip on structures in the environment. Well, I want to say, instead of thinking of the brain as encoding this kind of knowledge, so instead of thinking that, we can't say it's propositional knowledge, it's not like that. We can't really say what it is the brain knows, and this is a message that Andy's been pursuing since the 90s in his work on connectionism. So we can't say exactly what it is that the brain knows in propositional terms, but it better have some knowledge if it's going to be able to minimize prediction error. So even though it's not going to be conceptualized propositional knowledge that we could articulate, still the brain has knowledge which it encodes that allows it to minimize prediction error. Well, I want to say, hold on. We can think of what the brain has here as instantiating in its organization what Turvey calls affectivities, or a bit nervous about calling it that. We prefer to call it skills, abilities, that enable the brain within the whole embodied animal to track these information relations between patterns of energetic stimulation and structures in the environment. So are those abilities that the brain embodies in the whole organism, are those knowledge structures? Is it the right way to think about those abilities as knowledge structures? I'm not sure. So we're not going to get to the bottom of this because there's big issues here. But what we suggest is that maybe we can understand how past experience and learning get to bear on the organization of the brain and its controlling environmentally situated action. Maybe we can get an understanding of that, an explanation of that, without thinking of the brain as encoding representational knowledge structures. Instead, we could think in terms of the animal having anticipatory dynamics and the brain being central to that, because on the basis of the animal's history of interactions with the world, then it gets better at tracking these information relations between energetic stimulation and external structure in the environment. Last thing, Andy aligns himself with the enactivists, and I've been doing the same, but I want to suggest a different way of understanding inaction to the one that Andy proposes. So instead of thinking that meaning is brought forth through the interactions of the agent and the environment, the way that Andy makes sense of this is the environment is like the environment's providing the inputs that the agent is actively seeking out because those inputs are task relevant in some way. And so over time, when the brain is minimizing prediction error, it's getting better and better at seeking out the inputs that are needed for allowing the agent to get the tasks accomplished that the agent is needing to perform. So the meaning in the environment is brought forth through the control of the sensing by the agent. We talked a little bit about that already. But what we try to argue is that the environment's already meaningful because of the possibilities for action it offers. So meaning doesn't have to be brought forth. It's already there in the environment. And so how does the agent then get access to that meaning? How is it possible for the agent to perceive affordances? Well, that's where the notion of ecological information becomes important, that the brain learns to get tracking abilities that allow the brain to exploit this ecological information. So instead of thinking of meaning as enacted, we can think of it as already there in the environment, and the agent accesses that meaning through being able to, through its abilities for exploiting ecological information. Okay, so here are my conclusions. So I had started off by saying that there can be constraints that go from the level of the whole animal down to the explanations we give at the subpersonal level. So I argued for that by giving an interpretation of the free energy principle at the level of the whole animal and its environment. And then I've argued that that interpretation then constrains how we think about what the brain is doing. So we can think of the brain as doing Helmholtzian unconscious inference, but I've argued that if we were to think in those terms, then that wouldn't really fit very well with the inactive reading that I've given of FEP. So that leaves us then with the radical PP understanding of what the brain is doing, that it's controlling environmentally situated action. And then I've given you different ways of thinking about that, where if we think of it in terms of the animal tracking these information relations between energetic stimulation and structure in the environment, affordances, then we don't any longer have to think of the brain as encoding knowledge of long-term causal regularities in its generative model. We can instead think in terms of anticipatory dynamics and the brain being able to track these information relations. So GRIP then turns out to open us to the world because of these abilities for tracking and exploiting ecological information. And I've said that Andy needs that as well, probably because he has these two ways of understanding grip. On the one hand, we have the brain has a grip on the sensory barrage through being able to minimize prediction error. And on the other hand, the agent has a grip on the distal world, on the action possibilities that matter. And to get that gap crossed between having a grip on the sensory barrage in the brain, getting access, the agent getting access to affordances in the environment, I've argued that the brain needs to be tracking these information relations between energetic stimulation and the structures in the environment. So this is from Andy's Bristol talk, and I've argued that, well, grip is the new improved representation, it's just not representation. Thanks.